Okay, I might start the introductions here. Thank you so much for all of you for joining. I see there's quite a lot of you already. Some more may just trickle in the next minute. My name is Omar Khan. I'm the director of TASO. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Miriam.
Hello, my name is Miriam Stienel. I'm the Establishing Evaluation Manager for TASO.
Great. So how this is going to work is I'm going to say a few words of introduction. Miriam is going to give presentation for the webinar, and then you'll have some time at the end for questions and answers, and we'll be gathering those questions and answers throughout the session. This is our second installment in our evaluation webinar series, and we're really pleased to have so many of you here. We're really delighted that there's so much interest in our work. I know it's a bit strange that we can't all see each other and interact in the way that we would ordinarily in a seminar, but there are a lot of you here, and we also have a packed agenda. Just a few housekeeping for those of you who haven't participated in a webinar like this before. You're all automatically muted and your videos are off. The way that you then engage is by asking questions, if you have any. You don't need to ask any questions, but if you've got questions, there's a Q&A function, and as we say at the end, I'll be gathering them for Miriam to respond to. We will not be able to answer the questions in the chat box. And so while we do encourage you to ask questions, there's a distinct break to answer those at the end for us. And if you don't get a chance, if you don't have your question answered, please do send us an email afterwards. And we are recording this session, and we'll distribute the recording and presentation slides to attendees afterwards. We'll also be after your feedback, so please keep an eye out in your inbox for a post-event survey over the next few days. So I'm just going to dive straight in. We do have, how many of you on? Over almost 150 people are on the seminar. So today, Miriam will be talking you through everything you need to know about in the planning stage of your evaluation, including developing your outcome measures, choosing the right research method, and creating a research protocol. Before I hand over to Miriam, one last piece of introductions from me. I'm just going to give a brief overview of TASO. Now, it's actually only my third week in post at TASO, so this is a learning experience for me as well as you, and I'm really looking forward to it today. TASO is an independent hub for higher educational professionals to access research toolkits and evaluation techniques to improve equality within the sector. We're being set up by a consortium of King's College London, Nottingham Trent University, and Behavioural Insights team, and we'll be soon spinning out into an independent charity. I'm really looking forward to that. I previously I was the director of a charity called the Runnymede Trust, which focuses on race equality, and we did some work on higher education, but I'm really keen to do this work with TASO. TASO has a particular approach to using research and evaluation. We are affiliate What Works Center. Many of you may know or may not know what those are. And we are part, therefore, of the UK government's wider What Works movement. What that means is that TASO is committed to the synthesis, generation, and dissemination of high quality evidence specifically around improving access, improving student outcomes, including while in their courses, and of course, employment outcomes as graduates. And we are currently funded by the Office for Students for Total Transparency. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Miriam. I'm going to mute myself and turn off my video, but I will see you at the end for the Q&A. So take it away, Miriam.
Thank you, Omar. Welcome back to everyone who joins for the second time, and welcome to everyone who tunes in for the first time. So for those of you who joined us last time for stage 1 of our evaluation cycle, this slide will be really familiar with you. I always start with this because it not only synthesizes TASO's approach to evaluation, but it also answers one of the most prominent questions I get. So oftentimes I'm being asked, when is the best time to evaluate? So in general, it goes without saying that evaluation is normally more effective and credible when it is built from the beginning. Otherwise, there's sometimes a risk that the data collected is not completely appropriate for the purpose. So think if you want to measure lift effects on subject knowledge, if you run a session on, let's say, UCAS applications, if you don't have a pre-post knowledge test set up to test for that really quickly, you need to rely on other outcome measures as I stand, and that might take longer and it might not match your purpose completely. Nevertheless, evaluation can also be retroactively applied, as I just said. Nevertheless, at TASO, no matter when you start your evaluation, we consider evaluation to be iterative, something that circular design on the slide indicates already. It's a process that supports continuous improvement.
Sorry, Miriam,
yeah.
They can't see the slides. I think they haven't been shared.
Oh. Says share screen. Oh, sorry, guys. Missing out. I hope you can see it now. Let me, it says your screen sharing. If I don't hear otherwise, I assume that everybody can see the slides now?
Yes, they can. Yes, people can see it now.
Sorry for that hiccup. So as you can see, just to reiterate, this is our evaluation cycle. And no matter when you start your evaluation, we consider this to be a cycle. So the whole idea is that it is a continuous circle that supports continuous improvements, where the findings of your evaluation should feed into the refinement of your narrative in the following circle, which in return will help you shape your research questions to become more effective and your research methods to measure exactly what you want to do in future program cycles. By repeating and refining your evaluation strategy, your findings hopefully become more robust as you learn more and more about what works well in each consecutive year. And ideally, over time, you start to see patterns emerging and can generalize these annual findings to your wider long-term impact of a program. Crucially, and this is one of the main points I'd like you to take out of this webinar series, your evaluation findings should be seen as just one strand of a multifaceted approach to mobilizing knowledge. The reporting and reflecting of your findings at the last step, or like the fourth step of the cycle, should be seen as a foundation for further activities, rather than the end product in and by itself. So following up from that, obviously we're going to focus on the plan stage today. So it's the second of 3 webinars after we've already talked a lot around how to define your evaluation narrative via a theory of change in step 1. We put the recording of that session online if you've missed it or just want to revisit it. So if you go on our Twitter account, we've put a link up there recently. Today, we'll build up on that and we'll talk about how your evaluation narrative helps you to plan your evaluation and research. In detail, we'll guide you through how to identify relevant research questions. So what is a research question and how do I compile a research question that's relevant for my program? I learn how to identify corresponding outcome measures. Again, like what is an outcome measure and how do you understand the trickiness of like which outcome measures to use in the plenty array of data that we have in higher education now. But you also learn about research methods. So we introduce a level of research methods that TASO promotes and how certain research methods are better to answer certain research questions. And lastly, I briefly introduce a document called the research protocol and how important it is as a one-stop shop synthesis of all your thinking on your program. So before we jump into the plan stage, I quickly wanted to take a moment to tell you a bit about how the planning of your evaluation can help you and the wider higher education sector. Well, firstly, we can learn from past experience. Some of you might be familiar with the Aim Higher that ran from 2004 and 2011 collaboration. Just to get everyone on the same stage, running between 2004 and 2011, Aim Higher was the UK government's flagship national initiative for widening participation to higher education for young people from disadvantaged social groups. It costs approximately £1 billion. Despite research finding a positive correlation between Aim Higher initiatives and increased access, as well as improved outcomes for students from underrepresented backgrounds, evaluators at the end of 2011 were unable to clearly disentangle those outcomes from wider changes that happened in education policy at that point. This is reportedly part of the reason Aim Higher was continued in 2011. Even though for any of you who were around the WP field back then, we know anecdotally that there was a lot of good value coming out of these. Unfortunately though, the Aim Higher collaboration isn't the first time that a lack of evidence that is convincing to those outside the sector has led to calls to change the funding model for widening participation. So your planning stage can help you to make sure that outcomes are in place for when these things are questioned. Second of all, and that's a bit of a no-brainer actually, as it's true with almost everything, preparation and a clear plan is key. Failing to set out what your program is going to do in advance makes the whole evaluation process so much more stressful. As you haven't had an opportunity to think things through, to flesh out any challenges and barriers before going in and jumping into the field. The planning stage of your evaluation circle can help to clearly outline what needs doing, by whom, and prevents you from mission creep. And then lastly, and quite timely, developments like COVID-19, but before that even the Augur review, so it's not just a temporal fluke, are going to put WP funding in a really perilous situation with budgets across the sector clearly on the horizon. A well-planned evaluation, no matter if it's a well-run RCT, a high-quality case study, or insights from a really insightful focus group, they all can help us to make sure that we collect the right evidence for the right questions. And I hope that webinars like today, TASO can help us to move to an HRE evaluation world where it isn't so easy to point to a lack of impact evidence to justify cutting funding that supports the students who need it the most. So after having talked a bit about why I think this is really important, let's jump straight in. So identifying research questions. Having completed your theory of change in step one, you now have got a really clear idea on how your program is going to bring about the desired change. To help you translate this into a feasible evaluation plan, you need to identify corresponding research questions. As a broad definition, a research question is the overarching question that your evaluation will seek to answer. As in return, they will then also determine the scope and approach of your evaluation. At TASO, we recommend to develop up to 3 research questions, starting with your primary research question, the pink one on the left. For TASO, it means identifying causal impact of your evaluation. The primary research question is the main question mapping to your long-term impact claim of the theory of change. Again, if you've attended webinar 1. From that primary research question, so did my scheme increase main outcome among group X? So did summer school attendance improve enrollment rates among participants? You can then break it down into a secondary research question that can focus on intermediate outcomes or specific subgroups that are of interest for your evaluation. For example, for the summer school, an intermediate outcome could be, did the summer school increase sense of belonging to higher education? And for a subgroup that might be of interest, did the summer school attendance improve enrollment rates or sense of belonging to students with experience of family estrangement? And then lastly, because we're interested in the how, as well as the whether something works, think about appropriate process evaluation questions. Was the initiative delivered as expected? Or do we need to reconsider feasible implementation options? For example, and anybody who's ever run a webinar at 8 a.m. on a Monday will probably know that, did everyone attend all the sessions? And if not, do I maybe need to reconsider how I structure them? But also, are we targeting the right students, or should we narrow or widen our target group scope? And as we are working in an environment with finite resources, we need to query value for money and check whether this initiative is the best use of our resources, given its small or wide impact. So all of these questions together can help you understand how you're going to evaluate and where you stop and where you start and where you focus. So having identified your research question, we need to decide on the best outcome measure. In general, the mantra for outcome measures is, I know outcome A is reached when I see indicator A. So for our summer school, I know if it achieved our long-term impact of a diversified access to higher education providers when I see enrollment rates among, let's say, polar 1 groups increase in those higher education providers. When thinking about indicators though, we've got 2 different categories. One is the observable indicators, which are indicators we can build into our evaluation, as they're very easy to deserve and thus to control for. For example, those can be demographic data, such as age, or ethnicity, but also observe behavior or attitudes, such as attendance at the summer school that we can measure with our registers, or, as I said before, the sense of belonging that we can measure with like an academically validated survey. However, next to these observable indicators, there are also unobservable indicators. Unobservable indicators are also sometimes known as confounding variables. These are indicators that influence or at least are associated with both the treatment assignment, so that's a fancy scientific term for like, for example, attending and being selected to attend the summer school, and the outcome. So for example, a student then enrolling in higher education later. So for example, an unobservable indicator is motivation. And someone who is already motivated to go to higher education is more likely to, first of all, apply to a summer school and to engage with it, so our treatment assignment, but also to then actually apply to the university, our outcome. Unfortunately for us, things like motivation levels are hard to observe. And it's an indicator that we therefore can't really control for. A lot of times leading to biases in our effect size measuring. So to say our summer school was effective by X%. In the case of different motivation levels, this is, for example, called the self-selection bias. So how biased is a student to self-select themselves for a program? Confounding variables are actually the reason why correlation doesn't necessarily imply causation. In my opinion, finding the best proxy measures is oftentimes the most difficult bit of an evaluation. And you shouldn't need to do this alone. You are the experts on your programs. But TASO can also help to share some of the work we've been doing across the sector when we were looking at evidence in the sector and consequently available data sources that we can translate into outcome measures for all those out and in-reach activities out there. To facilitate exactly that, we've developed a common outcome measures framework, which we will send to you after the session, but which you can also find online. The common outcome measures framework can be found on this slide. So we created this to kind of provide a one-stop shop of some of the most common available data sources in the in and outreach field. TASO, with the help of our fantastic advisory groups, have developed this framework. So if you're familiar with different institutional WP or student success teams, you will know that there's a core set of common data points that are used in a lot of activities. On this slide, you will find an excerpt of what it looks like. The whole framework, as I said, is online and we'll forward it after the session. But we encourage you to use these measures as they're easily available already. They're often, if the case for like survey measures, pre-tested and validated. So they're very robust proxy measures for the respective outcomes. Quickly talking through this excerpt, going from the top left corner, measures are divided by year group. Here, we can only see key stage 4 and 5, but the whole framework ranges from key stage 3 to 5, the first year of studies, subsequent years of studies, and also a section on post-graduation. It then splits into common objectives for each of those year groups, and then provides examples of indicators for both process evaluation, as well as short, medium, and long-term impact evaluations. From my experience, I would say these outcome measures in the framework probably cover around 90% of standard in and outreach provision. But for some programs that are quite unique to your higher education provider, you may need to create indicators outside of those provided in the framework. For these indicators, they obviously don't come with pre-tested academic research. So you will need to consider how reliable and valid your indicators are for your objective. Again, more information on how you can rate the validity of your measures can be found in our monitoring and evaluation framework online. And we will actually focus a bit on that in our next webinar, so tune in for the next webinar if you want to learn more about that. But for today, and as a rule of thumb for outcome measures, questionnaires and scales that are previously verified by academics are always better than the ones that we come up with. So when you have a program that doesn't have an indicator that's of use for you in the framework, try to find research that uses similar message or recurring questions like the one you are interested in by Google Scholars, for example, and see if you can adopt a scale or an interview topic guide from one of those researchers. And second of all, indicators where we don't need the participant to give us subjective answers are always better than questions where people need to self-report. If your interest is to find out how much did someone learn through your activity. So use knowledge-based repeated quizzes that actually test increase in knowledge rather than just asking participants whether they feel they are more knowledgeable. So once you've identified your common outcome measures, and the question is now, how do you choose the most appropriate research method for your common outcome measures? And as discussed in our webinar on theory of change models in step 1, this all depends on your overarching goal. In this instance, your specific research question is more suitable for a specific research method. To illustrate this, I'm using a research method matrix on which you can see different research methods plotted according to their suitability for certain research questions. Looking at the end of each of those axes here, we've plotted some potential research objectives. On the vertical axis, you can see whether you are interested in observing attitudes, so for example, self-reflected preferences versus actual behavior. And on the horizontal axis, where your research question is more concerned with the how or the why, so subjective assessment of meaning, context, or experiences, or whether you're more interested in the how much and many, so objective comparison, seeing emerging patterns, and comparable measurements. As a disclaimer, this is my subjective plotting of methods, so there is probably variation on where these research methods could sit exactly on each axis and how they kind of relate to each other. Nevertheless, it outlines how certain research methods are more conducive for certain research questions. And it's up to you as a program expert to decide which ones you want to apply to your context and your research interest. As a word of general advice when choosing your research methods, I would say triangulation oftentimes make 1 + 1 = 3. And the mixed approach of how and why and how much and many is almost always best. Within the research that TASO commissions, so for example, the summer school randomized control trial we plan to run this year, we also have a triangulation approach, so mixing different methods. We did documentary analysis, so we looked at literature reviews to understand processes and hypotheses and theories of change that influence outcomes for summer school initiatives. We obviously use causal data analysis, and we talk about that later in the session within randomized control trial. So we use randomization to understand how attendance of the summer school affects enrollment rates and whether there's a causal link. And lastly, we also use closed survey to test for changes and attitudes towards higher education. So this form of well-integrated mixed triangulation of research methods can ensure that both strands of an evaluation, so both a process and an impact evaluation, if you joined last time, support each other and make the overarching evaluation findings much more robust, because we don't just understand what works, we also understand what works for whom, when, why, and in which context. Nevertheless, certain research methods, as I said before, align themselves better to certain research methods. To visualize this, TASO has created a research method matrix where we group different research methods into 3 distinct levels, depending on the focus of your research question and what you try to achieve with it. Level 1 at the bottom is the monitor level. So if you're investigating monitoring of your participants and tracking their outcomes, and that's your main research question, then that's the level of research that you should apply. Level 2 starts to progress on just the monitoring and tracking and compares the outcomes of your participants to non-participants. And then level 3, the identify level, is whether you want to identify, as I said before, whether these outcomes are caused by your program. So these purposefully align to the standards of evidence promoted by the Office for Student because we want to make them helpful. So when you use them or when you're going through the reporting of your findings in the monitoring and evaluation section of the access and participation plans, that is hopefully helpful for you. As Omar said in the beginning on the introduction slide, within TASO, we promote the development of robust causal evidence for biennial participation. So level 3 on the identify level, because there is a lack of that kind of evidence in this sector. We would encourage project owners to organically move towards higher evaluation levels, but as it says, I want it to be organic. So you want level 1 to be well established before you start integrating level 2, etc. We want to push the sector as a critical friend to be ambitious around it, but not to force it. For some programs and research questions, research methods, as I said, some of them will be much better than others. It is not possible for all your evaluations to become a level 3, and we'd rather encourage a really well-run case study than a badly run RCT. To go through those levels in a bit more detail, in the next slides, I'll outline examples of each evaluation, and I'll also dive a bit more deeply into level 2 and 3 for those of you in the audience who might not be completely familiar with what kind of research method that entails. So starting for level 1, and apologies, that's quite repetitive for you who've attended webinar 1. Level 1, the base without which the pyramid couldn't stand, is the monitoring level. On this level, your program will have a coherent strategy and activities that are selected to directly contribute to that strategy. So you've got a very clear theory of how you're going to implement and achieve the change that your program sets out to achieve. We know why we expect particular activities to work based on our theory of change and secondary research. And we are tracking participants' outcomes and experience to test for lift effects in our outcome measures via, for example, pre-post evaluation methods. Again, if you're unsure about theories of change, feel free to revisit the webinar recording and material from earlier this month on the TASO webinar 1. That will guide you on the hows and why to develop your own theory of change. Moving from level 1 to level 2, we get to match comparisons. So we reach the research messaging here that aims to compare outcomes. As the name says, the main difference between monitor and compare is that you are not just monitoring your participants, you're also comparing them to other similar individuals who have not participated in the program. A great example of a compare level research method is UCAP's Strobe service, if you haven't heard about it. It's a paid-for service that UCAS offers to universities. It allows providers to upload a set of participants to UCAS, who in return will provide you with a matched comparator group of your individuals based on their database of all applicants. So your matched comparator group will then match your uploaded group of summer school participants, as you can see here in the graph, on all these observable indicators we talked about beforehand. In this example, as I said, I've taken this graphic from their website. You have a group of summer school participants, and UCAS will match these two individuals within their database and tell you how your outcome, for example here, the enrollment at different universities. So let's say university group A might be selective universities, university group B is all other universities, and obviously the third group is students who didn't apply to university at all. So once they've matched this, they will tell you how these enrollment rates for your group might differ from matched individuals in the comparator group. As you're holding everything else constant, so that means all these observable factors are held similarly. So if your summer school participant group is 50% female, 50% male, your comparator group will match that as best as possible. So as you're holding everything else constant, you should get a clearer idea about the effect of your program participation on your desired outcome. So you're not just looking at your participants, you also now compare how that matches to a well-matched comparator group, which is like already quite a step up. However, that brings us to level 3, identify. So the idea to control for other variables such as age, gender, ethnicity, whatever you think is a confounding variable, as we said before, but in an observable way, definitely deserves its merits, but it comes with its own limitations. Unfortunately, it cannot control for these unobservable indicators that we mentioned before, like motivation, and we cannot easily observe them, and obviously can't control for them in a match comparison, but they can have a really big effect on our treatment assignment. So holding everything constant is a nice idea, but to illustrate that a bit for you, I've created an example. So we've got two participants. Let's call them Eliza and Miriam. Both of them are 18. Both of them are female. They both go to exactly the same school. Let's say they're also both from a BAME background. they even both applied to the summer school. And they both have so low GCSE results. So what you can see here, just looking at these observable factors, that have an effect on study success and enrollment at university. So as we know, ethnicity does, school type does, previous attainment definitely does, and even engagement with outreach activities here, right? They look really similar. So Eliza and Miriam seem identical, a great comparator for each other. However, as we mentioned before, we've got these indicators and variables that we cannot observe. But what is actually true for Eliza on the left is that she really likes her teacher, whereas Miriam, not that much. So what you can see here, you can kind of already see like engagement, like liking a teacher probably leads to more engagement in school, etc. Moreover, Eliza is pretty set on becoming a midwife. That gives her a really clear direction on her study subjects and can probably also help her when she wants to write the UCAS application for it. Miriam, on the other hand, doesn't really know what she wants to do after school yet. And so on. Eliza has a family supporting her to apply, enter, and succeed in higher education. Miriam doesn't. Eliza's study habits improve as a result of summer school attendance, whereas Miriam's more or less stay the same. So, starting from our beginning, even though the two women seemed really identical when we controlled for the observable factors like age, gender, ethnicity, the underlying unobservable indicators may bias our comparative findings. So thinking about Eliza, we might overestimate the effect that the summer school attendance had on Eliza applying and feeling like she belongs to higher education, whereas for Miriam, we might underestimate the effect. So how can RCTs help with this? One of the ways to get around this way of unbalanced comparison is a research method called randomized control trials, abbreviated RCT. With an RCT, we are not trying to account for differences between the groups by holding everything else constant. Instead, we randomly allocate our candidates. So for example, all eligible students who applied for the summer school, if, for example, the program is oversubscribed anyway. So we randomly allocate them to the treatment group, people who attend the summer school, and the control group, people who applied and were eligible, but who, for example, as I said, due to limited numbers of spaces, didn't get to attend the summer school. As this allocation is explicitly random, we expect that on average, the control and treatment groups are balanced in regards to both observable and unobservable indicators, because they are by nature explicitly randomly allocated there. So extrapolating the example of Eliza and Miriam, we might not have a perfect match between one Eliza and one Miriam in each group, but it is on average the proportion of both is the same in both groups. Therefore, we can expect that the outcomes for each group would be the same, because both unobservable and observable indicators are the same, and that any distinct effect that we might see between the two groups can be attributed to the treatment. So whether someone attended the summer school or not, because that's the only thing that's different between the two groups. So the fact that we can attribute any changes in that outcome measure to the treatment, as attendance of the summer school, as I said, is the only difference we expect between the two groups, is the reason we call RCTs and similar experimental and quasi-experimental research methods on level 3, causal research. They identify whether a treatment is working to change your desired outcome or not, and they give you that causal link rather than just the correlation. So just to illustrate this is what it looks like. Actually, once you set up your randomization strategy, it doesn't take that much longer than what I'm doing for you now in the presentation. We've got our sample size of eligible applicants to that summer school here on the left bubble, full of candidates like Eliza and Miriam. So we then run our randomization and produce two groups who have, on average, a balanced number of Elizas and Miriams in each of them. After that randomization, it is valid to assume that the two groups are roughly similar on their observable and unobservable characteristics, as I said before, because now we've got Miriam's and Eliza in both groups equally represented. When we measure the difference between the two groups, it gives us a more valid estimate of the causal effect, because the selection method is random, as you've just seen, and we have no prior reason to suspect that the groups are systematically different from one another. Randomization can, however, still produce unbalanced group, especially with small samples. And with everything else, every research method has its limitations. So the rule of small numbers, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is a fallacy that points out that small sample sizes are most likely not representative of the underlying population, and that outliers can bias your distribution quite significantly. So if you only have a small group, or a group with a small number of people sharing really important characteristics, these outliers, to randomly split into two groups, there's a higher chance that the groups are unbalanced, and that the people, if we only have two people with, let's say, estrangement in our sample size, there's a chance, if it's only a small group and with only two people in it, there's a chance that both people end up in one group, making them distinctively unbalanced if it's one of the really important confounding variables for us. A great example of that is actually Marvel's Avenger Infinity War, which is probably the nerdiest example I'm going to give to you in this presentation, but it's a really good example. So if you've seen it, great. If you haven't, I might spoiler you. But just to get everybody on the same page, in the movie, the villain, Thanos, assumes that overpopulation of our planet is a problem, and a problem that will lead to extinction for all of us. To prevent this, he decides to kill half the population. But to do so in a fair way, he decides to kill people at random. Obviously, I at TASO applaud the use of random assignment, even though I find the intervention a bit extreme. However, coming back to the point, what happens at the end of the movie, after he randomly kills off half the population, he finds himself in the situation where all the original Avengers remain alive, while almost all of our other heroes are dead. To me, and I said it's the nerdiest example I'm going to give you, so apologies. To me, this looks like a randomization failure, because his sample with a small number of outliers bias the randomization. Because you only have a small numbers of Avengers, and it ended up being in the same control. They all ended up being in the same group. I actually calculated, because it shouldn't have happened given he's got the whole world there. So it should have been a 1.6% chance of that actually happening. But nevertheless, it can happen. So there is a randomization failure. Of course, there are ways that we can statistically control for that. So you can do balance checks on your indicators. Unfortunately, again, only on the observable, not your unobservable variables. But you can also consider randomization strategies like stratification. So if someone is an Avenger, he probably should have stratified on that, because they're quite influential for him, and probably in the sequel it will come back to haunt him. Anyway, as I said before, this shows that even infinite power doesn't prevent you from randomization failure if you don't have a good randomization strategy in place. I hope that made sense to you, because you can apply that to some of these confounding variables that are also important to you. So you can do balance checks on some of those areas, but in general, you'd hope that the unobservable indicators are balanced in your control and your treatment group. And randomization is the way to ensure that in the best way that we can. After all that theory, I want to briefly mention a study to show you what this looks like in practice. So this is the effect of study supporter. That was conducted by the Behavioral Insights team in 2017. The project aimed to use text messages to improve GCSE English and Maths reset pass rates by prompting college students to attend classes and exams, engage with their study material, and form better study habits, either by contacting them directly, or, as study supporter says, by prompting a dialogue with the nominated study supporter, for example, a family member. Over the course of the academic year, weekly text messages were then sent to their study supporters with prompts on what to discuss in regards to the study material. Looking at the results of this study on percentage point increase on attendance of participants in classes, the naive comparison, so that is a scientific term for just saying we don't have any comparator or control mechanisms in place. We just compare pre-post attendance rates of participants who received the text to those who did not. So just looking at that, there is an 8.4 percentage point increase in attendance. That's quite a lot for one weekly text message, but that's just a naive comparison. When we control for observable indicators, so naive with covariates, such as age, gender, ethnicity, school type, this lift rate in attendance already drops by 1.4 percentage points. So we can already see how observable indicators might make a difference. So when we then compare attendance rates between participants who've been randomly assigned to the treatment, so what post-consent randomization means is that once people have signed up to be part of Study Supporter, you randomly allocated these applicants into control or treatment group again, the effect size almost halves to 4.7 percentage points. And what this shows is that only randomization, only that research methods helps us to control for a lot of these unobservable indicators, such as all the factors that we mentioned earlier that makes ELISA different from Miriam. Interesting enough, the Study Supporter trial didn't replicate. So the link at the bottom of the page leads to a meta trial run by the Education Endowment Foundation. Literally, I think 2 months ago, they published the results, maybe even less, that showed that actually that RCT doesn't work when you take it out of that context that the Behavioral Insights team ran and further out. So interesting point there also in regards to how RCTs can help you maybe make sense of your context, at least for 1 year, and then you replicate and you see if it matters in your context. But what works at King's might not work at UCL or LSE or any other university. So that's why it's also important to constantly reproduce, test, compare. So why does all of this matter to student success? So as I mentioned in the beginning, we have very little existing research that offers causal evidence, so evidence on level 3, but we have more and better data than ever before. So TASO is setting out to help bridge that gap, to upskill the sector and maybe using it and when to use it, to conduct research ourselves, but also to help bring that research to the forefront a bit more, because some programs, like and you might have some in your institution, can be RCT'd already. TASO offers like the evaluation support that I mentioned quite a few times earlier in that slide. So feel free to visit our website, like promote the webinars, run these workshops yourself, to hopefully get like an understanding of what levels work for binding participation to build our evidence base collectively and organically. But also, a lot of our programs are already oversubscribed. So like summer schools oftentimes have much more applicants than places available. And all that is required to actually translate that evaluation method into an RCT is a tweak to the recruitment process and the use of online tracking for HE progression data to recreate some of this, some of the research that I presented earlier in the slides. And also, it's incredibly easy once you've set it up. So once that system is in place, it can be implemented over a number of years, and the results can be aggregated, as I said before, to see how generalizable all these findings actually are. So for us, this is the research method that we are promoting, obviously being aware of limitations and not like obviously not disencouraging everyone from doing something else, but that's TASO's focus. And hopefully you got a bit of an understanding of what that research method is and how it's useful in certain contexts and not in others. To help you get an even better understanding of that, we've created the evaluation methods framework. Yes, another framework. So hopefully it helps you to get an overview over the variety of research methods that are available within each of the 3 levels we've created. So it outlines, as you see again, like process and impact evaluation methods for each level, their respective strengths and weaknesses, as well as the data requirements for each of the methods. So this again is an excerpt of the actual evaluation methods framework. We have like level 1, level 2, level 3 research methods highlighted for impact evaluation methods. And then we also have a research methods matrix for process evaluation methods. Again, this alongside all the other frameworks and templates I'm mentioning today are available on the TASO HE website, but will also be circulated in the follow-up message to webinar attendance following this webinar in the following days. So following up from research methods, and you've done all the work, the last step that you need to do in the planning stage of your evaluation cycle is creating a research protocol. A research protocol is a written document that describes the overall approach that will be used to your program or initiative, including its evaluation. We think it is important because it helps you to lay out a cohesive approach to your planning, implementation, and evaluation. And as a result, if you lay all of that out in one coherent document, it helps you anticipate and mitigate potential challenges as you write them up rather than as they occur. Setting out what you're going to do in advance for you is then like almost a mental reminder and opportunity to flush out any challenges and barriers before going into the field. It's also just a great document to create a shared understanding of aims and results with your wider team. That's why I always recommend that protocol should be written if it's going to end up in the hands of someone who knows very little about your organization, the reason for your intervention and research, or the implementation and context of your program and intervention. So it helps you in preparing, running, and evaluating your own program. But also, and like when we think back about the study supporter trial I mentioned earlier that didn't replicate, writing a detailed protocol allows others to replicate your program and your evaluation methodology, which is for us an important aspect of contributing to the broader research community and widening participation. Because if you clearly set out everything from your like thought process and secondary analysis, so finding the evidence to support your program, to how you implement it, how you recruit your participants, how you collect your data, how you clean your data, how you analyze your data, really helps for others to adopt and for all of you to learn from each other. Again, we have a research protocol template available on the website. So if you go online, you'll find that, and we'll also circulate it after the webinar to everyone who's attending today. So the last thing for me to say is some lessons from the field. So I thought I'd share some of the lessons learned because, yeah, a lot of things could go wrong for me when I started working in the field. So first of all, know your data journey. So really think through, and if possible, like sit down and look at data from previous years. Like what happens a lot is that you've got lots of attrition. So people dropping out, data not being completely complete, and you not being able to use it. And like being aware of how your data moves through the program cycle, and what format it looks like at the beginning and at the end will be really useful, and hopefully will help you foresee some of the challenges when you have to define outcome measures and research methods. Next, get to know the system and the people. Understanding who does what and how data is collected in a system can save you a lot of frustration further down when you're actually running the intervention. When you might realize that your outcome data, for example, isn't actually available in the format that you need it. So I ran an intervention, a program where we collected all the right data, and then we ended up realizing that there's your unique identifier because the people who collected the data for us as a welcome fair just didn't think that that was necessary. So understanding, again, how your data flows, what system it's in place with, and also understanding the people who you rely on to collect that data potentially for you is key. Third, look for smart interventions. So the SMART principle of using specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely goals is as true as gold, like in evaluation as well. So think through each of your steps on how it aligns to SMART and where you might need to do some tweaks to make sure that it is as succinct but as exhaustive as possible. Fourth, communicate and monitor regularly. So it goes a bit hand in hand with two, but really focuses on people. Communication is key to ensure that everybody knows what they're doing, that errors can be spotted before they cannot be reversed, but it also helps with buy-in. So particularly if you're working with an external partner school, it's important for you to monitor that things are progressing as you think they should. And again, the theory of change can help a lot with like measuring where your program is moving and what you need to look out for at each stage, from process all the way to impact. But also, it's important to remind your stakeholders because external schools have a lot going on, and even though they might have agreed with you to evaluate, 4 months down the line, that's about number 120 on the list of priorities. So communicating regularly to show maybe interim process successes and progress can be a really good way to not only remind everyone what they signed up for and to help people accountable, but also to keep them engaged. 6, use behavioral insights. So what I mean with behavioral insights, I'm referring to known biases and heuristics that we all have. If you haven't heard about it, I found the mind space principle really good, which was developed by Paul Dolan at the LSE. It's a principle that lines out common heuristics we need to consider when designing and communicating with, well, any stakeholder really. Mind space stands, like every letter stands for different heuristics. So for example, M stands for messenger. So consider a messenger effect. So if you want to recruit to your program, do you want this to come from a perceived authority? And what is the benefit of that? And how does your target group maybe react to that? Like, does your 16-year-old school kid know what a vice chancellor is? And does it make a big impact? Or would it maybe be better to use another messenger, like a student ambassador who might have come from a similar background and who speaks a similar language? So it makes it much more accessible and applicable to your 16-year-old potential program participant. And 6, which I mentioned when I started this, things will 100% go wrong. And I could fill a whole session, maybe one day I'll do, on all the things that didn't work and that I didn't consider when things go wrong. But that's a point of evaluation. And that's why we have an iterative cycle, because things will go wrong. And there's only so much you can do with all the preparation that you can do in your plan stage. But if you set out directly what you're planning and how you expect things to flow into each other, you know where things went wrong. You know whether it's an implementation failure because someone didn't show up to all the lectures, you know, if it's a methodological failure, like the method wasn't implemented as agreed, or whether it's a failure in a way that that's a combination of the two of them. So it will tell you exactly where the error lies, you know how to attack it, and you even it out for the next time. So you learn from it, start better and smarter the next time around. And lastly, TASO is here to help. So we've been set up to support the sector in building its evidence base. So particularly around causal identification of effects, as I said earlier. So visit our website, engage with our tools, run workshops in your own organizations, and get in touch if you've got any questions around any of these. So that concludes the presentation. So I'm sure there are some questions.
Yes. Miriam, that was excellent for me as well as I think for a lot of the participants. We have a lot of positive messages. We don't have a lot of time. We have over a dozen questions. I'm going to try to group. I think we'll have time to answer probably 6 or 7 because we can group them in groups. So I'm going to start with Katie's question, because it's a question that is also similar to one that Pete and Emma have asked. And the question is around numbers or sample size. So it's a question around lower limits. What is the low, for Katie's, the question I think is a good way to ask it. Hi, Miriam, please could you let us know what the lower limit for numbers involved is needed for RCTs to avoid the problem of small numbers?
Yeah, and I wish I could give you an answer and be like 50. Unfortunately, like as with always, it depends. There are certain things that you can use to lower your sample size. For example, if you've got historic data that is correlated to your outcome measure. So let's say for the summer schools, we know that we want to increase enrollment rates. And there are a lot of factors that obviously have an impact on enrollment rates, like attainment. So if we have a lot of that data on historical, like attainment for participants or like participants on the summer school, we get a good idea of trends and we can feed back into that. We can feed that back into our randomization, and our confidence of having balanced group increases because we know all the background information. There are statistical methods that can help you to identify your power, your statistical power, and as a result of that, also the minimum sample size. So if you Google power calculations, RCTs, like you'll get relatively straightforward calculations for that. I hope at one point we can run really, really focused sessions with TASO, and then we might do an RCT workshop where we go through all the nitty-gritties of how to do that. But in the interim, have a look at that. And I think the monitoring and evaluation framework also mentions a bit around sample sizes.
Okay, we will, I have a record of all the questions. I apologize in advance, we won't get to all of them. There is another sort of question around clarifying the difference between type 1 and type 2. So there's two questions sort of similar on this, which is, one is from Jane, is it difficult to get a level 2 evaluation without a comparison group? And kind of related, I suppose, is why does pre-post come into TASO level 1 monitor when I thought this was closer to OFS empirical level 2? That's Naomi. And similarly from Sarah, please could I ask for a clarification on type 1 and type 2, as I'm finding it difficult to distinguish when something becomes type 2. If we do a pre-post survey at events and track students into HE and use a variety of methods, would this still be type 2 or still type 1? Does type 2 require we have a comparison to another group?
Yeah. Okay, I've tried to keep track of all of them, but like Omar, hold me accountable if I miss.
Yeah, sorry.
If I've missed one of them. So I realized in the questions that we talked about types. So I assume that relates to the OFS types and not the levels of evidence that TASO promotes. So as I said in my presentation, they are aligned to the OFS, but they don't overlap. So there is some differences, and I can't go into too much detail what types the OFS is promoting on the different side. For our types, I can give you a really clear, for our levels, I can give you a really clear distinction. So level 1 is monitoring and tracking your own participants. So that can include pre and post surveys. It actually should, once you are like well run on level 1, but you only do them for your participants. So you only test lift rates on your outcome measure within your participant group. You don't look at anybody else. Whereas with type 2, you do these pre-posts not just with your participant group, but also with a matched comparator group. And that is a difference. So it already becomes a bit more robust because you're not just saying, this is our effect size, but this is our effect size in comparison to another group. Obviously, there's like different qualities of matching those comparator groups because, as we said, there are unobservable characteristics that we can't match up on. And there are certain ways that you can make it a bit more robust or less robust. But that's generally the difference between level 1 and level 2. So only participants and including a comparator non-participant group in level 2.
Yeah, I think that's a clear answer. I gave you a lot of questions there, Miriam, but that's a clear answer to Jane's question. Is it difficult to get a level 2 evaluation without a comparator group? And the answer is yes, you cannot. You need a comparator group.
Yeah, I mean, but then having said that, like, I don't want to like forcefully push programs into a higher level just because it's a higher level. I want it to be organic. So like, if you're not quite sure around how to build a good comparator group, get like your level 1 straight, where you know exactly how everything works before you start building comparator groups accordingly. TASO, the monitoring and evaluation framework has a bit of information on comparator group formation as well, and different methods to do that in the research methods framework, if someone is interested.
Yeah, we are running out of time, but there's a few questions around the ethical considerations and GDPR. So I just thought I don't know if you want to say anything. I mean, what are the ethical considerations required in collecting observable indicators, and can you explain how collecting some of those things are in fact GDPR compliant?
So I think this is more of an operational ethics than a moral ethics question, because we're talking about like, how can we like collect this data without having a deficient model in collecting that data? So first of all, GDPR isn't set up to prohibit collecting sensitive data like ethnicity, for example, like the sensitive criteria. It's there to make sure that you collect it in a way that is, making that protects the individual. So a lot of times institutions already have that GDPR set up, because as public institutions, they're allowed to report on that. And obviously there's lots of studies out there that show that it has an impact on outcome measures. If not, what oftentimes in research methods you do when the data isn't your own institutional data is that before that data is sent to you on these sensitive criteria, especially when you work with schools, you build the report, you make the partner schools or any external person know why you're using that data, that none of that will be identifiable, and that before the data is shared, unique identifiers are being taken out. So like the data source for Miriam isn't called Miriam and all the data, it's candidate one. And the same with Eliza or Omar or anyone else who would be in the data set. Of course, there are restrictions around the numbers. So like in general, the rounding rule is like if it's less than 5, it gets rounded to 0. If it's like between 5 and 6, I think it gets rounded up to 10. Don't quote me on that. So that is something that you need to consider. But ideally, those small numbers won't make that big of an impact for programs where you're interested in randomization anyway.
Yeah, I know we haven't got to all the questions, but I also know we're already 2 minutes over, and I want to thank you all for attending. I do have just a few slides to wrap up. The first thing to say is thank you. Thank you to Miriam, and thank you to all for attending. I know it's tricky in these circumstances to attend webinars in this way, although we're all getting used to it. If you'd like to read more about the content covered in today's session or the evaluation guide, please do visit our website. Miriam mentioned that we have, for example, a research protocol available there. We will also be running through the next steps in the guidance, which are steps 3 and 4, measure and reflect, in 2 weeks' time. So we may see some of you there again, and there's still spots available. So if you haven't booked, please visit the events section of TASO's website. And finally, while you're on the, not finally, penultimately, while you're on the website, I would encourage you to explore also our new evidence toolkit. So we're quite proud of this. It's a toolkit that summarizes existing evidence on approaches to widening participation and student success. We are going to ask for your feedback, so please keep an eye out in your email. We are committed to evaluating our own activities, including these webinars. And finally, we are also recruiting at the moment for research programs manager. If you know anyone who would be interested, please do send it through your networks, because we obviously want to build a great team here at TASO. And thank you for joining. And until next time, goodbye.